Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 25 August 2024. It is the 280th anniversary of the birth of Johann Gottfried von Herder, who was born in Mohrungen, then part of Prussia, now part of Poland, just south of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, where Kant was professor, on this date in 1744. The historian of ideas, Arthur O. Lovejoy, wrote an essay on Herder in his essays in the history of ideas, which begins with this paragraph, in which I've translated the titles of the books mentioned from German into English. Quote, a series of eminent German writers between 1780 and 1796 published what may be called progressivist philosophies of history, and these were, of course, intrinsically averse to most forms of primitivism and implied the rejection of the assumption of the superiority of nature to art. The most important of these writings are Lessing's The Education of the Human Race, 1780, Herder's Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind, 1784 to 1791, and some parts of the Letters for the Advancement of Humanity, especially book 6, Kant's Ideas for a Universal History with Cosmopolitan Intent, 1784, and Speculative Beginning of Human Reason, 1786, Schiller's What Is and What End and To What End Do We Study Universal History, 1789, and Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, 1795, unquote. That's a lot going on in the same period of time, and Lovejoy doesn't even mention Condorcet's sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human spirit, written in safe houses by Condorcet, was on the run from the revolutionary gendarme, and which was posthumously published in 1795, so within the same time frame as the works that are mentioned by Lovejoy, except in French instead of all the others he mentions are in German. In my episode on Fernando Braudel, I quoted Kenneth Clark as saying, great movements in the art, like revolutions, don't last for more than about 15 years. After that, the flame dies down and people prefer a cozy glow. I cited this as an example of what Braudel called a conjuncture in history. It seems the same is true of intellectual movements, and that these intellectual movements sometimes form historical conjunctures. The years from 1780 to 1796 were unusually intellectually productive of philosophies of history, and we could call them a conjuncture of philosophies of history. There are commonalities among these philosophies of history, all appearing within the same philosophical juncture, and all the philosophers who contributed to this philosophy of history conjuncture that Lovejoy identified influenced each other, but there are also differences among them. Lovejoy calls them all Enlightenment philosophies of history, and he says that they were progressive. Lovejoy gives an account of Herder's progressivism that features Lovejoy's favorite hobby horse, that is to say, the principle of plenitude, which Lovejoy had named in another book. And this is the idea that no possibility remains forever unrealized. Lovejoy says that Herder exemplified what he called the temporalized form of the principle of plenitude, according to which the totality of possibilities are realized over time. He quotes Herder as saying, quote, all that can be is, all that can come to be will be, if not today, then tomorrow, unquote. And this does clearly sound like Lovejoy's principle of plenitude. Lovejoy also says that progressivism is inimical to both primitivism and classicism. This is the source of conflict and contradiction in Herder, since Herder is particularly associated with a certain kind of primitivism. This is the kind of primitivism that we also find in Rousseau, another counter-Enlightenment philosopher, but Herder ultimately resolves his contradiction, Lovejoy says, by abandoning the primitivism. While the static conception of the principle of plenitude holds that one must keep to one's natural place in the world, which is a profoundly conservative idea, the temporalized principle of plenitude holds that one must never go back, only forward. From this forward movement of history, implied by the temporalized principle of plenitude, we get progress. Of course, there are many forms of progress, and we find them variously exemplified in the different Enlightenment philosophies of history. There is the progress of the human mind that Condorcet wrote about. There is the progress that Lessing thought was to be secured through education. And there was the progress embodied in Kant's idea of a convergence on a perfect civil constitution. Herder was a student of Kant, but Herder's metaphysics was quite different from that of Kant, as revealed by Herder's essay on being, which was only published in an English translation in 2018. In his essay on being, Herder is critical of Descartes. So that takes us all the way to the very root of modern philosophy, saying that Descartes, quote, drew conclusions for existential being from ideal being, unquote. Herder also wrote that, quote, the skeptical idea occurred to the excessively studious philosophers, unquote. He doesn't name Kant here, but Kant's philosophy was in large measure a response to Hume's skepticism, and we might reasonably identify Kant as an excessively studious philosopher. Herder thought that this skepticism was misplaced. He wrote of being that, quote, it is the first sensory concept whose certainty lies at the ground of all else. We are born with this certainty, unquote. So that flies in the face both of Descartes and Kant. So despite being one of Kant's students, Herder wasn't among those philosophers like Fichte who took up Kant's critical philosophy and repurposed it to their own ends. This isn't an altered form of Kantianism, but it's no Kantianism at all. Herder's philosophy was fundamentally different from Kant's. Different metaphysics are going to entail different philosophies of history, and Kant and Herder produced different philosophies of history with, of course, many commonalities given their shared social milieu. Kant saw that his former student had drifted some different distance from his influence, and he wrote 3 reviews of Herder's Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind. Herder also came under the influence of Johann Georg Hamann, an idiosyncratic thinker who was critical of Kant and whom Isaiah Berlin included among his rogues gallery of counter-Enlightenment figures that he sometimes identified as being the enemies of human liberty. Both Lovejoy and Berlin saw pervasive contradictions in Herder's thought, but whether Herder is more guilty on this score than a more purely Enlightenment figure like Kant or Lessing is not at all clear to me. Apologists of the Enlightenment, like Isaiah Berlin, would have us believe that the Enlightenment is uniquely coherent and consistent, and its advocates necessarily reflect this. But I don't share that point of view. Herder, like Rousseau, was a counter-Enlightenment voice who came from within the Enlightenment. So he shared many of the presuppositions of the Enlightenment worldview, but he also differed from those Enlightenment thinkers who stood unambiguously within the Enlightenment tradition. When I read Herder, I'm impressed by the naturalism of his work. Now, this could just be me projecting my own presuppositions onto Herder, but it would be too much to argue that naturalism burst onto the scene fully formed with no previous development later on in the 19th century. But the naturalism that I see in Herder isn't something you hear about in the focus on Herder as a counter-Enlightenment figure or as an early prophet of nationalism. He was both of these things, but the thrust of his contribution is not what he had in common with other Enlightenment thinkers. Contemporary naturalism probably has its origins in the scientific revolution, prior to the Enlightenment, and it was subjected to descent with modification during the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment both accelerated and modified the naturalism of the scientific revolution. If we survey the range of Enlightenment thinkers, we can find this naturalism variously exemplified, but it doesn't appear in its pure form in any of them. One of the things that divides the Enlightenment philosophers of history among themselves are the traces of naturalism that each picks up and develops in their own way. So there are traces of naturalism in Condorcet, in Kant, and in Herder, but they are different traces, differently developed in these different contexts. The traces of naturalism that Herder picked up on are themes that resonate with me personally, so much of Herder's thought comes naturally to me. I should say that it makes more sense to me than any other Enlightenment-era philosophies. Of course, your mileage may vary. Even today, the content of naturalism is disputed, so it's easy to find various interpretations of naturalism today, not to mention the 18th century. I could also argue that the different kinds of naturalism picked up on by the different Enlightenment philosophers was to some extent a function of their metaphysical views. Kant, with his distinctive idealism, was not going to work the same naturalistic themes into his philosophy that Herder, with his rejection of Kantian metaphysics, would work into his thought. If you can find an unabridged edition of Herder's Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind, which is, in its unabridged form, a rather large book, and this was the T.O. Churchill translation of 1800, so it was published while Herder was still alive, you will find that it begins with a naturalistic account of Earth as part of the solar system, calling Earth a star among stars. Book 3 opens with, quote, "Beasts are the elder brethren of man. Before he was, they were," unquote. The more widely available abridgment doesn't include this, and instead begins with Book 7 after these naturalistic preliminaries. This is one of the reasons to always look for an unabridged edition of any book if you can find it, since what is edited out may furnish the context that alters the meaning of what follows. By starting out his Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind with a naturalistic account of the earth, plants, and animals, the later sections on humanity and the development of human history are placed in a naturalistic context. There are several suggestions of evolution in Herder, and some commentators have rushed to assure us that Herder didn't mean anything like what Darwin would propose later in the 19th century. Lovejoy was among those commentators, but Kant seems to have caught a whiff of it, and in the supplement to his first review of Herder, he wrote, quote, "This would lead to ideas which are so monstrous that reason recoils from them. Either one species would have emerged out of the other, and all out of one single original species, or perhaps all would have emerged out of a single primordial womb," unquote. Kant, in short, was horrified by what Herder was suggesting, but Kant, in his usual perspicacity, has placed his finger directly on the fundamental problem. In Origins of Life research, these two ideas are still being debated to the current day. It's often said that Kant was ahead of his time in his cosmology, but he was also ahead of his time in envisioning the possibilities of naturalistic origins of life, even if, so to say, negatively, since he rejected these ideas as monstrous. For Kant, Herder's implicit evolutionism wasn't merely unempirical, it was irrational. So here's more from Kant's review of Herder. Quote, "This idea of organic force belongs solely to speculative philosophy, but if we were to gain entry even there, it would cause great havoc among accepted conceptions. To want to determine what arrangement of the head, externally with regard to its shape and internally with respect to its brain, is necessarily connected with the propensity toward an upright posture. Still more, to want to determine how a simple organization directed solely to this end could contain the ability to reason, a pursuit therefore in which the beast participates, that patently exceeds all human reason. For reason, thus conceived, totters on the top rung of the physiological ladder and is on the point of taking metaphysical wing, unquote. The editor of Kant on History, Louis White Beck, which includes Kant's reviews of Herder, reassures us in a footnote that Herder really wasn't suggesting anything like that, anything at all like evolution in what Kant was picking up on. Quote, Kant is interpolating evolution into the thought, a notion that Herder expressly repudiated. There's nothing here of transformations and revolutions, one into the next, of the multifarious species of the earth. In the very section which Kant is now criticizing, Herder writes, no creature that we know has transcended its original organization and violated it by preparing itself for another. Elsewhere, he repeats, man and the ape were definitely never one and the same species. Nature has formed each species well enough and given it its own heritage. Kant's case upon Herder rests partly on imputing to him a defiling evolutionism, unquote. I don't think that this is an adequate response to the differences between Herder and Kant. Even though Herder did explicitly repudiate evolution in the passages quoted by Beck, it would not be misleading to call Herder's work an evolutionary philosophy of history. And it is this pervasive evolutionism that led Kant to interpret Herder in the way that he did. And Kant was horrified. His third critique was all about teleological reasoning. So it is almost as if Kant had intuited the body blow that natural selection would come to be for teleological conceptions of nature. The naturalism that Kant assimilated into his thought was such as could be reconciled with his teleological conception of nature. Herder can be understood in this way, as an evolutionist before a mechanism for evolution was proposed. That is to say, an evolutionist before natural selection was understood. We can call this evolutionism if we like, or we can call it the temporalized principle of plenitude, as Lovejoy called it. There is, of course, much more in Herder's philosophy of history than his evolutionism, but the evolutionism is important, I think. For Kant, evolutionism was the mind taking to metaphysical wing, and Kant believed that he had given the lie to all metaphysics. Herder rightly intuited that an evolutionary treatment of history is not metaphysical, but rather naturalistic. At least that's how I read Herder. I suspect that Lovejoy would have insisted the temporalized principle of plenitude was a fundamentally metaphysical position, and therefore Herder isn't really as naturalistic as I am saying he is. But I think there is room to rationalize naturalistic evolutionism with the temporalized principle of plenitude, but that would be a project for another time. Herder was no philosophical naturalist in the contemporary sense, however, but he was much closer to being so than Kant or others of his time. As such, Herder constitutes an important intimation of contemporary thought. That being said, the later parts of Herder's ideas for a philosophy of the history of man read much more like Condorcet than like Kant. Kant was concerned to show the convergence of human history on a perfect civil constitution. Condorcet's vision was more epistemological. Recently, in an episode, I said that Husserl's ideal vision of humanity was a vision of ideal knowledge, while Shaler's vision of ideal humanity was more political, social, and cultural. We can also see this divergence between Kant, whose ideal is more political, and Condorcet, whose ideal is more epistemological. Herder is more like Kant and Husserl, Herder is more like Condorcet and Husserl, and less like Kant, but there are hints also of what Shaler was getting at. In book 15 of the Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind, Herder paints a picture of humanity as the end and aim of human nature, which is quite close to what Shaler would later write. So Herder writes in book 15, chapter 1, which has the subtitle, Humanity is the end of human nature, and with this end, God has put their own fate into the hands of mankind. And Herder says, quote, in all states, in all societies, man has nothing in view and could aim at nothing else but humanity, whatever may have been the idea he formed of it, unquote. And, quote, thus, whatever good appears in history to have been accomplished, humanity was the gainer. Whatever foolish, vicious, or execrable was perpetrated ran counter to humanity, so that in all his earthly institutions, man can conceive no other end than what lies in himself, that is, in the weak or strong, noble or base that God gave him, unquote. And further along, also in book 15, in chapter 4, the subtitle is, from the laws of their internal nature, reason and justice must gain more footing among men in the course of time and promote a more durable humanity. And in chapter 4, he formulates what he calls 3 general principles. First, times connect themselves together in virtue of their nature, and with them the child of time, the race of mankind, with all its operations and productions. Secondly, the habitations of mankind render the progress of the human species still more evident. Thirdly, in consequence of the internal nature of the human mind, its activity has hitherto been employed solely on means of grounding more deeply the humanity and cultivation of our species and extending them further. So that's from the later parts of the outlines of a philosophy of history of mankind. Of course, that title has been translated in many different ways by many different people. So some people just refer to it as the ideas. Some call it the reflections. Some people call it the outlines. But in any case, the ideal outlined in the outlines, or whatever we want to call it, was humanity developing its own powers under its own responsibility, which is very much like what Shaler said. And in exchanging, as I said in my episode on Shaler substitutes humanity somewhat for what Hegel had as the end of history, as being the development of absolute spirit and the development of absolute knowledge. Herder also develops the political and social implication of his views, especially in his letters on the advancement of humanity, some of which are included in the English translation of some of his collected philosophical writings. So happy birthday, Herder, and thanks for listening.